Hey everybody, welcome back to History Student Reacts. Today we'll be watching the 3rd Century Crisis Part 2, Enter Aurelian by Extra History. Now last time, we really covered almost the entirety of the 3rd Century Crisis, all the way up to the beginning of the reign of Aurelian, which tells me that this series is really more about the end of the 3rd Century Crisis than covering the crisis itself, because Aurelian he is the one who restored the Roman Empire, who really brings all of this to an end, of course, with the help of Diocletian about a decade later, who sort of stabilizes the situation. But Aurelian, he's the one who's going to move us away from this era of chaos. Certainly one of the most important Roman emperors, a fascinating fellow to cover. Now, if you guys end up enjoying this one, I'd appreciate it if you'd leave a like on the video, subscribe to my channel, and check out my Patreon, which is linked down below. Now, with all of that out of the way, let's jump right into this reaction.
Northern Italy, 271.
Hmm.
It's an ambush. Aurelian, acclaimed as emperor just a year before, has been fighting to turn back a Vandal invasion. But with the Roman army engaged, another Germanic tribe sees their chance to slip in the back door. They march into northern Italy and begin to plunder. Alarmed, Aurelian races south, sending a demand ahead of him: surrender. But a messenger brings back their reply: challenge us and see how a free people can fight. Aurelian was definitely seeing it now. The barbarians had ambushed his army as they moved through a forest. Now, Roman soldiers were nearly unbeatable on an open field, but in this dense terrain, their ranks are broken and the men exhausted from the non-stop march.
Yeah, I mean, you do not want to go up 1v1 against the Roman legions, and so the better option is to catch them unaware or manage to funnel them into some sort of trap.
They flee with heavy casualties. And now, there is no force between the barbarians and Rome. A city up to this point considered so safe, it doesn't even have a defensive wall.
We'll change that.
Rome lies undefended, the emperor's army broken.
And so we see here at the beginning of Aurelian's reign, his relatively short reign actually, he begins with having to defend Italy itself against these Germanic tribes. We'll see throughout his reign that Aurelian deals with the most pressing issues first, most close to the heart of the Roman Empire, and then slowly moves out throughout the rest of his time as emperor. So we're starting here right in the heart of Rome, Italy itself, with the most pressing issue, which is stopping the city of Rome from being sacked.
The rich retreat to their villas in the countryside. Priests call on gods for protection and consult oracles, and panic grips the streets. But Aurelian is not a man so easily cowed. He rallies his armies, puts down 2 revolts against his authority, and sends them into a pursuit. The enemy is using the road network to march toward the capital. But here, the disciplined Roman troops move faster and overtake them. Aurelian pins the barbarians against the river, now on open ground that favors Roman tactics.
And Aurelian was, of course, one of these military men who had gone on to become emperor. In fact, he had been a cavalry commander under Gallienus, that emperor who I mentioned last time, who didn't get much coverage in the video itself, but who I think is actually really important to the story of the end of the 3rd century crisis. So Aurelian, he's getting a lot of cavalry experience under Emperor Gallienus. He's bringing that to his time as emperor. He's bringing that military experience, and that was a necessity for the emperors of the 3rd century crisis. You needed to be a successful general.
And his attacks are so ferocious that when the barbarian force breaks, some flee into the river and drowned. For this, the Senate granted him the title Germanicus Maximus, the victor of Germania. And that was just the first time Aurelian saved Rome, and it would not be the last. In fact, Zoe...
And it won't be the last title he's granted either. We'll see some even grander titles given to him.
Let's get that scoreboard in here. Here we go. All right, Aurelian won. Yeah. So where did this extraordinary guy come from? Well, we still don't totally know. In fact, a lot of things about his reign are still obscure, even what order events happened in. Born a peasant in what is now Serbia, or possibly the Balkans, Aurelian rose to the army during the 3rd century crisis, with the army eventually acclaiming him emperor when his old commanding officer, who had been emperor before him, died. He had to knock off the old emperor's brother first, of course. You know how these things go. But within months, Aurelian's rival was dead, and the Senate handed him the reins. Yet, unlike many of the short-term rulers of the crisis, Aurelian had a mission. He was going to reunite the empire. After defeating the barbarians,
He was an ambitious guy, but it's worth noting Aurelian's reign, while it might be long for the 3rd century crisis, it's only 4 short years, right? It's not an incredibly long amount of time. So with him, it's really incredible how much he does with the time he has.
attempt at sacking Rome, he returned to the capital to enact a series of reforms, the first of which symbolic as well as practical. He built a defensive wall. Now, technically, Rome already did have one, but it was 500 years old, erected when the city was much smaller, and in the intervening centuries, the capital had sprawled beyond it like water overflowing a basin. And a new wall had never been built because Rome wasn't thought to need it. In better times, enemies could never penetrate so far into Italy. But these were not better times.
Mm.
So Aurelian began construction,
These were some of the worst times.
certain that Rome would need to defend itself again. And with that taken care of, he then turned to the
He was right. He built defenses around Rome. Those defenses would be needed. However, as the Roman Empire continued past the 3rd century crisis, Rome, the city, is not going to be the capital, right? Rome is going to take up a couple of different capitals, most prominently Ravenna, which is further up Italy, further north. The reason for that is one, emperors needed to be closer to the action. We saw this with some of the emperors last time. Many of them never even went to Rome. They were too busy out in the provinces. And so, the Roman Empire needed a capital closer to those provinces. And so, Rome itself, the city, was deprioritized. Additionally, Ravenna is essentially situated in a swamp. It's a lot more defensible than the city of Rome. Now, of course, Aurelian's putting up walls to defend the city, but over time, Rome is going to be sacked time and time again, even after it's no longer the capital of the empire, since it does still have symbolic importance. But it shows you the kind of era we're heading into of Roman history, and Aurelian, he recognized that.
economic crisis. Remember last episode when we talked about how the gradual debasing of Roman currency had created a monetary crisis? That was only part of it. Because while Aurelian started instituting a new law that coins had to be at least 5% silver, which for the record made them worth 20 times less than the full silver coins minted when things were going well, he ran across.
Well, by the way, that shows you how bad things had gotten. Aurelian needs to institute a law making these silver coins be 5% silver, right? So what does that tell us? That tells us that many of the coins were less than 5% silver, right? So that shows you how bad this debasement, this inflation had really gotten. That 5% even was a sort of return to some sort of normalcy, right? Now, certainly that wasn't Aurelian's end goal, but the fact that he had to start there shows you how bad the monetary situation was.
A scandal at the mint. Corrupt employees were embezzling from the state by funneling some of the raw silver into their own pockets and debasing the currency even more. But when Aurelian put the head of the mint on trial, the other mint workers and their allies in the Senate staged an uprising that spread to the population, who were already restless due to a grain shortage. In response, Aurelian
A
called
grain shortage, in part caused by Palmyra, a sort of Roman successor state to the east, which was cutting off grain to Rome itself. I'm sure we'll talk more about Palmyra later in the episode.
in the army, and Roman troops fought vicious street battles against their own population, casualties running high as his army was pelted with cobblestones, once again forced to operate in a dense environment where their field tactics were no help. But in the end, he put down the revolt and reorganized the mint. Point Aurelian. That done, Aurelian marched into the Balkans, his home territory, to defeat an invasion of Goths. No, not those Goths, Nick. These Goths. Thus, the Senate gave him a new title of Gothicus Maximus.
Another
Meaning-
title?
Well, not that, but definitely another point on the board, Zoe. Then, he turned his attention to reunifying the fractured empire, which had split into...
And this was the great project of Emperor Aurelian, right? We see he wants to stabilize the empire, what remains of it. He has to defend the heart of the empire from some of these German tribes. He's trying to stabilize the political situation with currency and defensive walls around the city. But his big project, after all of that, is to reconquer the territory that has been lost to reunify the Roman Empire.
Three parts just before his reign began, large portions shearing off like an iceberg breaking apart. And of those parts, the Palmyrene Empire was
Mm.
the most worrisome. A decade before, Palmyra had been ruled by Odenathus, a king loyal to Rome who had saved the Eastern Empire from Sassanid invasion. But now that man was dead, and his wife Zenobia.
Yeah, and that's a case of something you see many times in Roman history, especially at this point, where you have essentially a local big man, right, who can sometimes be an independent ruler, a general, a lord, whomever, who operates in many ways autonomously, but is still loyal in one way or another to the centralized Roman state. And so they allow that type of character a degree of autonomy because he is still defending Roman interests. Now, during the 3rd century crisis, a lot of those local big men, or in this case, a woman, Zenobia, they decide, meh, we don't really need the Roman state anymore. You're not giving us anything. Why don't, instead of having a degree of autonomy, why don't we go fully independent?
Zenobia ruled on behalf of their young son. As Aurelian consolidated power, she too battled border raiders and rebels, bringing all of the East under her control while claiming to do so on behalf of Rome,
For
though
now.
increasingly behaving like a separate empress. And then she invaded and occupied Egypt, which was a problem, since Egyptian grain sustained Rome. And if Aurelian moved against her, Zenobia could effectively starve the capital at a moment's notice.
Mm-hmm.
Remember that grain shortage during the Mint Revolt?
Yep, I mentioned this earlier. We're seeing it now.
Yeah, that was probably Zenobia. So Aurelian was not having it. Partially because it was an affront to his rule, partially because he wanted to keep the empire whole, and partially because Rome was a misogynistic society who had a particular loathing for foreign queens. You know, like Cleopatra, the queen who also cut off Egyptian grain, and who Zenobia increasingly compared herself to in public.
Yeah, and there are a lot of comparisons from the Romans as well between Zenobia and Cleopatra, right? They had this sort of vision, this archetype of the Eastern Queen, right? Very much framed around the character of Cleopatra, who was very foreign and different and indulgent and all these types of things, and who was a threat to Roman martial society, right? So there was a lot of, I guess, sort of propaganda around a character like Zenobia. But of course, Zenobia also represented a very real threat to Roman authority in the region.
So yeah, Aurelian decided he would knock out Zenobia first. He dispatched a fleet to take back Egypt, and at the same time, marched into Palmyrene territory. In response, Zenobia dropped the act and officially declared the Palmyrene Empire independent,
Yeah.
crowning herself empress and her son emperor.
Yeah, she crowns herself empress. They're now a fully independent empire of their own. And I mentioned last time that one of the ways we can actually separate a legitimate emperor from an illegitimate emperor or a pretender is whether or not they got their face on the money, right? That's honestly one of the ways we can tell the difference. And what we see here is that Zenobia begins minting coins that do not have Aurelian's face on them, right? So that's really an act of war, an act of political war. She's saying we no longer recognize your authority as Emperor of Rome. Now it's me and my son. We are the legitimate rulers of this empire, Palmyra.
Their forces met in open battle outside Antioch, the Roman troops exhausted from the march and the extreme heat. First came the infantry push. Palmyra's heavy cavalry smashed into the light Roman horsemen, driving them from the field in a pursuit. Seeing this, the Palmyrene general presses hard, sensing victory. Ha! He even sees his heavy cavalry returning on the horizon. This was too easy. Wait, what? Oh, those weren't Palmyrene horsemen.
Uh-oh.
The Roman cavalry's break had been a feint. Aurelian had ordered them
Yeah,
to
remember, Aurelian was a cavalry commander under Gallienus, and Aurelian had served under a couple of Roman emperors, by the way. I just like Gallienus in particular. So Aurelian particularly had experience in this type of warfare.
to pretend to flee in order to tire out the heavier Palmyrene riders. Then, at an order, the Romans wheeled and reformed ranks, smashing into the now disordered enemy cavalry, and quickly approaching the enemy infantry. The Palmyrene generals sounded retreat, knowing it was over. The next time the armies met, it was a replay.
Mm.
The Palmyrene cavalry falling for the trick again, and for Zenobia, there was nowhere to go. So she held out in Palmyra, weathering Aurelian's siege, until internal politics forced her to go on the run. And
Yeah, I think Zenobia, she's sort of remembered as someone who essentially overextended herself, someone who was extraordinarily ambitious, and because of Odenathus and then her own leadership, she had this incredible position of authority, pretty autonomous from the Roman Empire, in many ways, but she decided it wasn't enough. She needed full independence. She needed to declare herself empress. Now, I think the question is, even if she hadn't done that, would Aurelian have come to try and reconquer the territory? I think there's a good chance, yes, in the long run, Palmyra was always going to be an issue for any Roman emperor who wanted to reunify the Roman Empire, which Aurelian wanted to do. Now, Zenobia probably stepped further than she should have, but I think even if she hadn't taken those final steps, Aurelian would have probably been around the neighborhood. Maybe not as soon as he was. And of course, he only rules for about 4 years, so maybe it wouldn't have been him. But eventually, I think Rome would have been back, even if Zenobia had tried to sort of keep to herself.
Aurelian caught her as she tried to cross a river into Persia. Though he killed most of her generals and advisors, Zenobia he spared and sent back to Rome. Palmyra, too, he left untouched, at least until he was eventually battling rebels in Egypt and found out the city once again revolted. Then he returned to flatten the place, pulling down its monuments and buildings. For this, the Senate named him Restitutor Orientis, Restorer of the East.
We're getting some more impressive titles. He's still got one more to go. That's not the most impressive title, because he's got one big accomplishment left to go.
And for that, another point for Aurelian. Now, he looked to the west, but the so-called
You
Gallic
can probably tell where we're going next.
empire there would not be so difficult.
Mm-mm.
Aurelian broke the rebel army in a single battle, taking its emperor Tetricus prisoner. In fact, the whole battle may have just been a diplomatic maneuver.
Yeah, and this is because the Gallic Empire had already been greatly weakened by the previous couple of emperors. By Claudius, who is the immediate predecessor of Aurelian, by Gallienus, who had come before, right? The Gallic Empire was weakened, it had already been reduced in size and power, and so in many ways, it was ready to crumble. Palmyra took a fight, Zenobia, she was ready to go. The Gallic Empire, on the other hand, no, it was not really prepared to fight. It had already been pretty substantially weakened.
A way to get close enough to Tetricus, so the man who wanted to surrender but feared getting murdered by his captains could defect. Sneaky. Aurelian sent the disgraced former emperor on to Rome and then ordered the rest of the rebel army slaughtered. He'd done it. He defended the imperial borders and sewn the riven empire back together. And for this,
Yeah.
the Senate named him Restitutor Orbis, Restorer of the World.
And that, of course, is Aurelian's grandest title. It doesn't really get more grand than that. Restorer of the World. And I love that because it tells us a lot about Rome and the Romans, right? I mean, he reconquers the East, they call him Restorer of the East. He reconquers the West, right? He's reunified the empire. They don't call him Restorer of Rome. They call him Restorer of the World. Shows you that they held themselves in very high regard, right? I mean, this is true for a lot of these great empires. Rome, China, the Persians. They saw themselves as the great singular world power, right? And so for these Romans, when Aurelian reconquered the territory of the empire, he wasn't just restoring Rome, he was restoring the world. At least the world that mattered. So I always liked that one.
And yeah, mark it up. When Aurelian returned to Rome, he celebrated a military triumph, a ceremony that was part religious and part victory march. In this grand parade, Aurelian's
Yeah,
soldiers...
Aurelian was a big fan of the sun god. It's interesting, we see in this time period, that Christianity is getting more and more popular. And of course, one of the qualities of Christianity is you have one God, right? Which is very different from the polytheism that was so popular to Rome throughout its history. Well, Aurelian here, he wasn't a Christian, but he was a true believer in one God too, the sun god. So you see more of a movement towards that monotheism during this time period.
Servants displayed exotic beasts from faraway lands, prisoners from kingdoms that Italians were only dimly aware of, and handed out free grain and bread reclaimed from Egypt.
Mm.
Then, near the parade's zenith, were the two most incredible prizes, Tetricus and Zenobia, renegade emperors of the East and West, chastened and humiliated, wearing gold chains.
Yeah, and of course, if we want to carry the Cleopatra comparison forward, Augustus, or I guess Octavian is what he would have been called at the time, rather than Augustus. He wasn't quite Augustus yet. He would have very much liked to have taken Cleopatra back alive to Rome and to have marched her through the streets in a triumph. However, she killed herself before he could, and that might have been one of the reasons she took her own life, is because she didn't want to be humiliated in a ceremony like this. Well, Zenobia, she didn't get the chance, so she ended up in this position.
And finally came the emperor himself, mighty Aurelian, giving thanks to his personal deity, Sol Invictus, the unconquered sun. In 4 years, he had done what no other could, and within another year, he would be dead. Wait, really?
Yeah.
Oh, I always have the worst luck in my fantasy emperor draft. Legendary thanks to...
As with the emperors of this era, Aurelian does not have some grand and dramatic end. His life ended as many emperors of this era did, but we'll talk about that in part 3. So yeah, we've seen the vast majority of the reign of Aurelian. Of course, there's the end of his life to go, but after that, we're going to see the aftermath of his reign, what's to come. Seems to me, in fact, they told us that we're going to be talking a lot about Diocletian, who I also find an absolutely fascinating emperor, reigned a lot longer than Aurelian did, and I mean, I think it's hard to say who was more fundamentally influential. You can make a good case for both. I mean, you could make the argument that Aurelian literally reunified the empire and made sure it would survive, which I think might put him above. But, you know, Diocletian was someone who made some really fundamental changes to the empire that would continue throughout really the rest of the history of the Roman Empire, East and West. That's some pretty important and impressive stuff. Either way, I think they're both fascinating emperors to discuss. If you guys enjoyed this one, I'd appreciate it if you'd leave a like, subscribe to my channel, and check out my Patreon, which is linked down below. With all of that, hope you guys are having a fantastic day today. I'll see you all again next time. Goodbye.